Miss Jane Nalunga. Trouble with the audio in Kampala, but let me just tell you a bit about who our speakers are as the team in Kampala, the technical team fixes the audio issue. On trade policies to developing countries and regional groupings, both in Geneva and in national capitals. Before joining the South Centre, Vahini served as an international trade negotiator at the Department of Trade and Industry of South Africa, and she covered negotiations under SADC, the tripartite FTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and the World Trade Organization. She also represented South Africa as a diplomat at the country's mission to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, where she was the focal point and coordinator of the African group in the WTO. Vahini holds a Bachelor of Laws degree and a Master of Commerce degree, and she'll be giving us a keynote address. I think you can notice from just my introduction is that we really, I look forward to hear what she had. I'm certainly interested in the state of trade in Africa, and if I'm zeroing down to East Africa, because it is very, very important for the growth of our economies, but also because we as Africans are bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change, given that most of us, like I said in a previous webinar, in the African context, you can hardly go back you can hardly look through, if you're looking at your family, you can hardly look through 3 members of your family without finding one who is actually a farmer, an actual somebody who only earns out of agriculture. And also the agriculture that we earn out of as Africa, which is still the backbone of most of the economies in Africa, agricultural based, is rain-fed agriculture. And so climate change and any effects that adverse weather patterns create is going to affect most of us at a personal level. So it is certainly very important for us to talk about Africa and for Africa to have a voice with regard to climate change, but also to trade, because that is the only way that we can get goods and services moving, and that's the only way that we can actually grow our economies. Trade is very important. The climate is very important. And sometimes at various COP meetings that I have attended, these two interests, the interests of trade and the interests of the climate action, sometimes get at loggerheads. But we'll talk about it later and try to dig deeper and understand what exactly we can do. So I've been informed that the team in Kampala has managed to fix the audio, and now, without further ado, allow me to welcome Miss Jane Nalunga to give us her opening remarks, live from Kampala.
Thank you so much, to this very, very important meeting where we are going to discuss how to promote a mutually beneficial relationship between trade policy and climate action. Today's discussion sits at the heart of one of the defining challenges of our times: how to reconcile the imperatives of trade and climate action in such ways that advance rather than constrain Africa's sustainable development. For too long, trade and climate policies have evolved in parallel and sometimes even at cross purposes. Trade rules have often restricted green industrial policies, discouraging local content requirements or targeted subsidies that would help us to build domestic renewable energy industries. At the same time, climate policies such as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the European Directive, deforestation directives, have also penalized the most marginalized and the poor countries. At Symbiotic, we believe that trade policy must not be climate blind. And on the other hand, we also believe that climate policy must not be trade naive. The two must mutually reinforce each other. Whether trade accelerates or obstructs climate action will depend entirely on how we design these rules and the values we embed within these rules. For Africa, this is not an abstract debate. As you know, the African continent contributes the least to global emissions, yet they suffer the most from climate impacts. Yet we also remain marginalized in the global trade, where we account barely 2% of the world trade. And we have to remember that most of the minerals and resources that power the global green transition are found here. But unless the trade and investment frameworks change, we continue to be marginalized and will continue to transact these minerals under unequal terms and deepen dependence instead of driving green industrial transformation. In Symbiotic, we have continuously advocated for a number of issues. One, we advocate for policy space for African countries to use trade and related policies to foster green industrialization and a just energy transition. Two, we advocate also for inclusive multilateralism that ensures that global trade rules, including those at the WTO, support rather than restrict the developmental and climate priorities of the global south. We also advocate for regional approaches, such as the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the CFTA, that can build shared capacity, resilience, and a collective voice in shaping a fairer global trade and climate architecture. As we move forward to COP30 and the WTO, the 14th WTO Ministerial Conference, we must seize this opportunity to integrate and coordinate our climate and trade agendas. This means that we embed climate ambitions into trade frameworks, while ensuring that climate measures uphold the principles of equity, common but differentiated responsibility, and the right for every country to development. Let this dialogue come up or generate concrete recommendations so that Africa's voice is not only heard but can be able to shape a future which is just and which is sustainable. I welcome you all to this very, very important conversation. Thank you. Over to you, Daniel.
And climate policy should not be trade naive. That is one for the books, surely. Now, I would like to welcome Vahini Naidu, who is going to give us our keynote address from the South Center. Let's all welcome Vahini Naidu.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much for this opportunity. So distinguished colleagues, partners, and friends, first, let me begin by thanking Syatini Uganda for the kind invitation and for convening this important dialogue. It is a privilege to address you on behalf of the South Center at a time when the interface between trade and climate action has become central to global economic governance. As we look ahead to COP30 in Belém and the WTO's 14th Ministerial Conference in Yaoundé, this is a moment to consider how the multilateral system can promote a genuine alignment between trade, climate, and development. For a long period, the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment was largely dormant. Discussions were limited to information exchange, and few members viewed the committee as a setting for substantive policy debate. But this has changed. In recent years, participation has widened and the agenda has expanded, with developing countries, including from Africa, playing an increasingly active role. They have helped to reorient the conversation towards inclusivity, transparency, and development priorities. African members have anchored their engagement in three principal areas. First, proactive transparency and ex-ante impact assessments of climate-related trade measures. African delegations have underlined that transparency must not end with post hoc or after the fact notifications. It should include early information sharing, structured dialogue, and practical support to assess the impact of new measures on trade and development. The call is for a framework that allows developing countries to understand and respond to how new climate-related standards or border adjustments will affect their exports, value chains, and industrialization plans. Second, the operationalization of technology transfer and capacity building commitments. This must move beyond the exchange of technologies to ensure their real diffusion, affordable access, and adaptation to local contexts. The African Group has argued for a multilateral framework on technology transfer that links trade rules directly to development outcomes, especially in digital and green sectors. Operationalizing technology transfer should mean building the innovation systems, human skills, and institutional capacities needed to drive Africa's green industrial transformation. But it also means strengthening South-South and North-South cooperation so that technologies are integrated into national and regional development strategies. Mainstreaming adaptation, technology diffusion, and just transition goals into the COP30 Just Transition Work Programme will help African governments, industries, and communities to participate fully in the global green transition. Third, the preservation of policy space for green industrialization, energy access, and job creation. Africa has made clear that industrial policy is not a deviation from global trade rules, but a foundation for sustainable development. The African Group has consistently argued that WTO reform must rebalance existing rules that limit the ability of developing countries to industrialize and diversify. This includes reviewing the trims and subsidies agreements to restore the flexibilities needed for investment promotion, local content development, and research and development support. The group has also called for reinstating non-actionable subsidies that promote technology, development, environmental protection, and regional growth, and for caution against opening environmental goods markets before domestic industries can compete on fair terms. A credible trade and climate framework must therefore safeguard each country's right to define its own path to industrialization while fostering transparency and cooperation. This engagement demonstrates Africa's growing confidence in shaping how trade and environmental objectives can be reconciled. It also reflects the continent's discernment of what a credible green transition entails. African countries recognize that sustainable industrialization depends on affordable technologies, reliable financing, and long-term investment in human and institutional capacity. The African Group has therefore linked its engagement in the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment to its broader agenda on industrial policy, technology transfer, and structural transformation, as outlined in its proposal on policy space for industrial development, as well as in last week's paper on Africa's proposals for reforming the WTO. At the same time, African members have not shied away from expressing concerns. The rapid growth of parallel initiatives, such as the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions and the Dialogue on Plastics Pollution and Environmentally Sustainable Plastics Trade, has created both opportunities and risks. These forums have introduced useful perspectives, but have also fragmented the policy landscape. Many countries, developed and developing, have noted the duplication of work, the heavy burden on limited delegations, and the creation of informal norms being developed outside the WTO's consensus framework. The challenge before us is how to consolidate these strands into a coherent multilateral approach. The WTO Committee on Trade and Environment remains the legitimate forum for trade and environment discussions, and its centrality must be reinforced. Africa's delegations have consistently called for greater coordination between the WTO and other processes to avoid fragmentation and ensure that policy coherence is preserved. African members have also examined with rigor the implications of new climate-related trade measures such as the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and the deforestation regulations. These measures, though presented as climate instruments, creates additional compliance burdens and new forms of protectionism. African exporters face structural disadvantages in meeting reporting and certification requirements, and there is no guaranteed support for adjustment. The African Group has called for prior notification, dialogue, and technical assistance to ensure that these and future measures taken in the name of climate do not undermine sustainable development or market access. But beyond these defensive concerns, Africa's engagement is defined by a forward-looking vision. The group's recent communications emphasize that policy space for green industrialization is essential. Africa cannot be expected to transition without the tools to build domestic and regional production capacity. The continent's critical minerals will play a defining role in the global energy transition. But that contribution must be governed by principles of sovereignty, transparency, and value addition. The goal is not only to supply, but to process, innovate, and trade competitively within a fair global framework. In that context, the South Centre is proposing mechanisms to strengthen transparency and accountability in the global trade of critical minerals, including a notification and reporting framework on the sourcing, processing, and value addition of critical minerals. This could help ensure fair pricing, traceability, and responsible investment while advancing Africa's ambition to capture a greater share of value from its resources. A broader multilateral cooperation agenda or framework on trade and environment could complement this by improving information sharing, and linking trade policies directly to financing and technology transfer. As we approach COP30, Brazil's proposal for an integrated forum on climate change and trade, the UNFCCC, provides an opportunity to address the growing intersection of trade and climate in a structured and inclusive manner. The proposal circulated to the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment recently sets out an informal, non-binding and non-negotiating framework designed to complement, not replace, the WTO and the UNFCCC. Its value lies in creating a space for cooperation among trade and climate communities, fostering mutual understanding and identifying solutions that balance ambition with fairness. For Africa, coherence is a political and practical necessity. Climate-related trade measures cannot be allowed to impose disproportionate costs on developing countries or to shape new hierarchies of competitiveness. The UNFCCC can help foster transparency, but these discussions must ultimately be anchored within the joint work program on just transition at COP30. Linking the trade-climate interface to the broader objectives of sustainable development, poverty reduction, and job creation is the only way to ensure that cooperation translates into meaningful outcomes. Africa and Brazil, together with other partners from the Global South, have a shared responsibility to drive this conversation towards implementation. The aim is not to add new processes, but to ensure that trade, climate, and development are treated as mutually reinforcing. Practical steps could include mainstreaming adaptation, technology transfer, including diffusion and technology access, and just transition goals into the COP30 Just Transition Work Program, establishing structured coordination between the COP, WTO, and UN agencies to promote coherence and reduce duplication, and creating mechanisms to monitor delivery of support commitments to developing countries. These measures would bring a degree of order and accountability to an increasingly complex landscape. We also need to be realistic about the context in which we are working. The multilateral system is under visible strain. The G20's WTO reform discussions could not reach agreement on even the most basic terms of multilateral cooperation, like inclusive, development, rules-based, or sustainable. It is a reminder of how deep the political divides have become. In this environment, meaningful progress is unlikely to be gained in new declarations, but in steady cooperation, practical solutions, and a shared commitment to fairness and development. African countries have shown that participation in international processes is important, but it cannot be the end point. It must also lead to coordinated, sustained action. This requires continued investment in institutional capacity, expanding technical expertise in standard-setting bodies, and aligning regional and national policies around shared development priorities. Governments have a particular responsibility to ensure that trade and climate policies work in the public interest and remain accountable to the people they are meant to serve. Civil society, academia, and the private sector are essential partners in this effort. Their knowledge, scrutiny, and collaboration help keep policies grounded in evidence and responsive to national needs. Together, these partnerships can make the trade-climate agenda more transparent, credible, and effective. The WTO's work on trade and environment shows signs of progress, but also of imbalance. The Committee on Trade and Environment has regained relevance, new initiatives have emerged, and Africa's engagement has become more visible and substantive. The next step is to bring these efforts together in a coherent framework that advances both climate ambition and development priorities. If the next phase of trade and climate cooperation is to mean anything, we believe it must carry the imprint of developing countries as partners shaping the rules and outcomes of a fairer global system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wahini. Very important what you said about African countries and developing countries being at the table as partners, not just as respondents. So thank you very much, Wahini, for starting us off. And we are going to get into a discussion about the issues that she has raised, but also the topic that we have today. And as I told you, my panel is big and my panel is strong. So let me introduce them. We'll start with Yasmin Ismail. Yasmin is a senior policy advisor at the Forum on Trade, Environment, and SDGs, and is an independent expert on digital trade. She brings to TESS 15 years of combined work experience in project management, international relations, policy research in the fields of trade, law, and development. Her research on trade and environment focused on interlinkages between the trade and climate change regimes and covered issues like special and differential treatment and common but differentiated responsibility, aid for trade and climate finance, and integrating trade policies in nationally determined contributions. Let's all welcome Yasmin Ismail. Yasmin, say hello to our viewers and listeners.
Hello, everyone. Distinguished speakers and colleagues. Thank you so much for the introduction, Daniel. Shall we proceed, or would you like to introduce the rest of the panelists?
I'm going to introduce everybody first, then we can proceed with our opening statements for this. Now, on my panel also has Dr. Andrew Mould, who is the director of the Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA. He is a British national with a background in economics, holding a master's from Cambridge University and a PhD from the Complutense. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Complutense, yes.
Yeah,
University of Madrid. I believe that name must be in Spanish. His work has focused on development economics, particularly on topics like inter-regional trade, industrialization, and international aid. He has also served as an editor for the European Journal of Development Research. Please go ahead and say hello to our viewers and listeners, Dr. Andrew Mould.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, Jane, Danielle, Yasmin, Vahini, and Martin. Thank you very much, Syatini, for the invitation, and look forward to the discussion.
All right, Martin Luther Munu is a PhD candidate at the Institute for Globalization and International Regulation, IGIR, and Faculty of Law at Maastricht University. Munu is a PhD candidate at the Institute for Globalization and International Regulation. His research focuses on e-commerce negotiations at the World Trade Organization and their potential impact on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises' growth in African countries. At Maastricht University, he teaches and supervises students in various courses, namely international relations, themes and theories, skills, legal research and reasoning, and international trade law. Globalization, trade, and development are some of the other things that he teaches. Previously, he worked with the Economic Policy Research Center, EPRC, in Uganda, researching on trade and regional integration issues, and the Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, Syatini, on bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations. Munu has attended and made several presentations during stakeholder initiatives seeking to promote development outcomes in the multilateral trading system. He also worked with Consumer Unity and Trust Society, CUT, in Nairobi on trade and development issues. Welcome, Martin. Please say hello to our listeners and viewers.
Thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon, participants. Thank you for the warm introduction. I'm excited at this webinar, also sharing the panel with distinguished presenters and trade advocates and diplomats. So this is something that I'm happy about, and I look forward to the deliberations. And thank you very much to Syatini for organizing such an important platform.
All right, thank you very much. Now, Yasmin was earlier itching to start. So, Yasmin, you start us off with your opening remarks. I'll give everybody an opportunity to tell us what they think about the topic. When we sent you that topic, what's the first thing that came to your mind? Yasmin first.
let me start by thanking Siatini for the invitation. It's great to be with distinguished speakers and be invited to this discussion. The first thing that came to my mind is the fact that we are a few days away from COP30. Trade is becoming more and more, unlike like 5-6 years ago, trade is becoming part of the conversation taking place in the UNFCCC, something that we couldn't envisage years ago. And we have MC14 ahead, and Vahini, as Vahini mentioned, things started to also move and change within the WTO and the CTE in addressing the trade and climate nexus. So the conversation is very timely, and one of the things that I want to highlight in my opening remarks is that I think to summarize the key question that we're addressing today, it is twofold: how climate action is impacting trade, and how we can harness trade and shape trade cooperation to serve as levers for climate resilient, low carbon development in Africa. And before I go into the details of answering this, but just to highlight in my opening remarks, the triple challenge that Africa countries face on the climate and trade nexus. First is the imperative to adapt to the impact of climate change on Africa's trade infrastructure and ability to produce and trade. The storms, sea surges, floods, prolonged heat waves, and droughts are already affecting the price and quality and availability of essential goods and services in sectors such as fisheries and agriculture. Climate impacts affect yields, crop productivity, or natural resource endowments. So that's a first key, very central challenge. At the same time, African countries increasingly need to adjust to the impact of trade-related measures applied by third countries on their exports, putting sometimes the burden of adjustment on them despite Africa's minimal share in total GHG. And a third is African countries have a strong interest in economic transformation and diversification that delivers sustainable development and prosperity for their citizens and region. In that regard, many recognize the need for economic transformation and development that is climate resilient, and many have expressed a strong interest in climate resilient industrialization. So that perception that has been sometimes spread out in the climate discussion that African countries, or more generally developing countries, since their emissions are menial, they are not active on climate action and ambition. That's not true, and I think this is becoming more visible to the world. For the majority of African countries, the transition to a low carbon economy is only viable, however, if it contributes at the same time to poverty reduction, structural economic transformation, and other pressing development imperatives. For countries with limited fiscal space, high debt burdens, and limited access to private investment, these challenges call not only for effective financing mechanisms to assure a just transition, but also cooperation on technology to secure access, absorption, adaptation, and scaling up of technologies vital for climate mitigation and adaptation. Let me stop here, and perhaps we can continue later, or would you like me to go through the rest of my speaking points? Let me know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Yasmin. I'm going to give an opportunity to the other panelists to also give their opening remarks, and then we can go deeper. Dr. Andrew Mould, what came to mind when you saw the topic? But also maybe you can also, just like Yasmin did, talk a little bit about any risks that are there from the current state of affairs, where it looks like trade policy is being discussed away from the climate negotiations, that climate negotiations are also being, in the words of Ms. Jane Narunga, climate policy is being trade naive. What a word. Dr. Andrew Mould, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I didn't actually prepare any remarks for this conversation. I wanted to really react to what I heard on this particular topic. And I have to say, I haven't worked very extensively on the links between trade and environment. I'm a trade specialist more than anything. But I do think it is important that we recognize the crisis which the global trading system is currently in. And you know, obviously, the tariffs which have been imposed by the United States, the reaction by other countries to those tariffs, the fact that the WTO now doesn't have a dispute settlement mechanism which is functioning for the last 6 or 7 years, the fact that the WTO has struggled to get any consensus through over the last 2 or 3 decades, I think we have to live with that reality that the multilateral system is really not very functional at the moment. And the conversation needs to turn towards that, I think, when we discuss the link between trade and what Africa's ambitions are in terms of negotiations. Very short, Daniel, just to kick off the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Mould. Munu, it's your turn now. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Daniel. My thoughts on this topic is really an interesting one because I've had a lot of work on linkages between trade, agriculture, and climate change. Over 10 years ago when I was working with CATS International, and incidentally, Siatini was also a partner in that project. And over the years, I've taken a lot of interest in both research and in terms of also policy engagement on how trade can contribute to development. And the discussion of climate change in this case cannot be ignored because we know very well the impacts of climate change, especially on the least responsible countries in Africa. So my first impressions were, if we want trade to be used as a tool for development, Yasmin talked a lot about this. I don't want to repeat the issue of structural transformation. Maybe I would add more in terms of industrialization, diversification, and proper or more beneficial integration in the global value chains. So, and the issue of employment and decent jobs, not just employment. And the broader issues of our sustainability cannot be ignored in these discussions, and how financing, who can finance this, or who will pay for this huge economic social transformation agenda that African countries want. And so bringing the climate change aspects into this became interesting for me because of the current preparations for COP30 and how countries can better prepare to align their trade interests, adapt, mitigate and adapt to climate change, and attract that global support in line with the multilateral agenda for addressing climate change, the issues of special and differential treatment, the issue of common but differentiated responsibility. And what became even more worrying for me is the shift that the international community is experiencing. Countries are experiencing a shift, there are geopolitical shifts. And so the interest of countries, one in even addressing climate change and financing and promoting cooperation, is becoming more and more challenging. And also what Andrew mentioned, even trade, there's rise of I could say more state-oriented or national-oriented interests above global cooperation. And so bringing all these issues together is something that I look forward to discussing in this webinar. I'm not sure whether we'll really find answers, but maybe we can identify pointers that can take us forward for future deliberations or research or even policy engagement. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Martin Luther. Let's go back to Yasmin. We just want to understand what is the current state of affairs. There's the European green trade policies that have had us talking for a very long time. Down here in Africa, we are not they're not very popular, I must say, because they're creating lots of problems. But looks like trade and climate are delinked. But you'll tell us, what is the current state of affairs and what are the risks that we are currently facing with the current state of affairs?
Thank you. Well, in my perspective, sustainability policies and measures ranging from voluntary standards to climate-related requirements and border carbon adjustments are spreading, and they are becoming signals to where the global economy is heading, right? We are entering an era where access to advanced economy markets, and I can say also soon also emerging and developing country markets, will rely on meeting a range of requirements, such as embedded carbon emissions, deforestation footprints, and circularity-related criteria. While these measures aim to internalize environmental costs and achieve emissions reductions, while addressing carbon leakage, they also risk externalizing adjustment costs onto their developing country trading partners. And as the range of measures increases and the number of countries and companies introducing policies and requirements grow, we are seeing a general proliferation of environmental requirements with a highly fragmented approach. Indeed, governments and businesses are increasingly recognizing that this proliferation raises challenges related to transparency, coherence, and effectiveness, as well as equity and development concerns. As such, there are a range of discussions at the multilateral level underway on ways to improve the interoperability, equivalences, and mutual recognition among such measures. These discussions are currently happening over some proposals in the Committee on Trade and Environment of the WTO. A major challenge ahead of Africa is that many exporters are yet to develop their capacity and their access to data, traceability systems, verification systems, and technology to comply with such measures and compete in this evolving concept. At the same time, grappling with all of these standards will require that African countries engage with their trading partners on the design of their policies and requirements so that the challenges facing African exporters, including MISMEs, are addressed and there is support for the transition. In this regard, it will be critical for African countries to engage in the ongoing discussions at the international level to enhance transparency, as Vahini mentioned, of these measures, but also ensure interoperability and equivalences among different approaches and ensure that development concerns, equity, and fairness are considered and addressed. At the international level, a cross-cutting priority will be for African countries to highlight the importance of transparency, consultation, development, and international cooperation as key principles that should inform the design and implementation of trade measures with climate objectives. Strategic engagement with their trade partners is also critical to ensure that such measures are accompanied by the capacity building and sustained investment in local capabilities. This will really make the difference between these measures becoming a barrier to trade or a driver of green transformation, industrialization, and competitiveness in ways that unlock long-term market opportunities. Thank you, Daniel.
All right, thank you, Yasmin. I want to bring in, I want to bring in Martin Luther on that, especially on the issue of how to use trade to foster climate resilience. Because if these two very important policies, trade policy and climate policy, are being discussed at cross purpose and they are at loggerheads, and we are having areas of conflict, is it possible to use then trade to in a way foster climate resilience? Is there a common ground where we can have a discussion, and do you see this happening?
Well, thank you. There is always a common ground because that is what global cooperation looks at. In as much as there are differences in opinions and approaches, but reaching a common ground is the ultimate objective for any negotiations. So in terms of climate change, I see, for instance, the unilateral measures like CBAM we are talking about. There are measures that developed countries have taken, especially in the EU, to address their footprint, to promote green economies, and to promote sustainability. And these measures are plausible, even though we know the issue of sufficiency is questionable because of the inability of all these measures to meet the UN target of 1.6 degrees C. But they are a good starting point. And from the positive, we see that they can provide market access to countries that can comply. And so I would say African countries can be able to work with the developed countries or the EU to promote compliance to promote compliance such that they can meet the requirements. I know there are much in terms of enabling traceability, things to do with certification, which even requires third parties, the registration and meeting all the requirements along the value chain. But this is something that if an African country can get integrated, it can meet. But the major challenge is the issue of financing to meet these requirements. So there is a huge gap in financing that needs to be addressed. And so the climate change negotiations needs to focus on that. How can we have concrete finance, not recycling previously commissioned or committed finances, but having concrete, verifiable funding mechanism that can be used. Secondly, we need to enforce special and differentiated treatment provisions in all these negotiations. And this goes hand in hand with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So if we see in this trade negotiation, but also in the climate change negotiations, there is proper recognition of the historical contribution or responsibility of climate change, and the proper recognition of the need to substantially increase the exports of developing countries, specifically LDCs, as one of the objectives in the preamble of the WTO agreement. The issue of building domestic productive capacities to increase industrial output, to increase the integration of local communities in the production, to facilitate their market access, address their production, the barriers to production and the barriers to entry in market. If funding can be secured to address this, we can have this common ground. But for me, what I also see as important is still the need to maintain that consistency between the two different multilateral frameworks. From the one side, the WTO, and on the other side is the climate change and negotiation, the UNFCCC. What I mean here in this consistency is that at the WTO already, we are having challenges. The issue of reform, what has been floated by the US, the abuse of SDT by China. This is informed by geopolitical issues and also the rise of China. These are the issues that we need to confront. But the African countries need greater unity. They need to work together more and build their houses in order, first at the AFCFTA level, to increase that intra-African trade, to increase coordination at the national and regional level, as well as continental level, in such a way that trade policies facilitate this development interest, but also addresses the issue of sustainability and avoid measures or practices that drastically undermine conservation practices or undermine efforts to address climate change, but balance this. One discussion I see coming clearly is the oil and gas industry. And we see a lot of pressure from developed countries to drastically reduce or even discourage financing, for instance, for a country like Uganda. And this has become a kind of controversial issue. But if we take the principle of common but differentiated responsibility on the principle of special and differentiated treatment, we should be able to promote some form of exemptions or flexibility, for instance, longer transition period or less ambitious targets for African countries, coupled with financing that is adequate and predictable, but also reliable, such that these countries can incrementally have that transition which is just, but not just imposing transition from the targets by developed countries and shifting these targets to African countries, which they then have to pay in terms of compliance. So that would instead make trade policy undermine development. It would shift the responsibility of addressing climate change a lot disproportionately to African countries, and it would undermine all these other objectives that we have at a bilateral level of increasing exports of LDCs, of integrating developing countries into the global value chain in a way that is more meaningful for their structural transformation agenda. And it would also increase more unilateralism at the expense of multilateralism. Already we see a lot of unilateralism happening. And these measures will only increase it, because African countries, we have heard from Yasmin, they have also taken a number of measures. We have seen the NDCs, for instance, to address climate change at their pace. Even the policy discussions have shifted. Over the last 10 years, a lot of these discussions could be only facilitated by donor engagement, for instance. But we see also a shift that nationally or even at the local government levels in African countries, policymakers or actors are aware of these issues, and they are trying their best to adapt and mitigate to climate change. But now this brings us to the question that, with all these measures being put in place by African countries, do we see it being replicated by developed countries? For instance, if we see in the oil and gas industry, what is the consumption levels? We need to ask ourselves these questions. And what is the agenda of phasing out or transitioning from this? Not only looking at quoting existing output or the funding that has been put into science and research and development, for instance, by developed countries, but actual current consumption, for instance, for oil and gas. We see it as very high, and we see this consumption for African countries as very low. And so if we had to use responsibly these resources, now we should be asking ourselves an important question, that how far should we go? And how far should this be replicated by the developed countries? And how much funding and technical support should African countries receive, such that we can have a just transition?
All right, thank you very much, Martin Luther. I want to bring in Dr. Andrew Mould, especially about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And I noticed Martin also spoke about it. And to you, Dr. Andrew, I just want to understand if we can use this Africa Continental Free Trade Area as a vehicle to advance Africa's climate-related and green industrialization goals. And is it a target that you think is within reach, or is it something that, as Martin says, we need money? Martin has laid down the gauntlets. We need money, and someone has to fund all of these things that we're talking about. All right, Go ahead, Andrew.
Goodness, I don't know where to start, to be honest, Daniel. I should just stress that I'm speaking in a personal capacity, not an institutional one, because I think some of my points of view I might express here don't necessarily coincide with those of the Economic Commission for Africa on a couple of points. But Martin, that money is not going to be forthcoming. We have seen so far, all the promises on finance commitments has been underwhelming over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And in addition, when it has been available, it's normally been a reallocation away from other financing. And currently we're confronting a situation where the US has basically liquidated USAID, massive impact on some of the countries in Eastern Africa, but we also see all the other donors falling in line with reductions. I think there's only 2 countries in the world maintaining their donor commitments at the moment: Italy, I believe Japan, and South Korea. I think all the others really dramatic cutbacks. So we cannot expect a global multilateral deal where Africa is genuinely going to get the kind of money you're talking about for financing. I mentioned in my opening remarks about the disarray of the WTO system, but of course that also carries over to the climate negotiations with, you know, the world's largest or second largest emitter, the United States, actively undermining the multilateral commitments there. It's going to be very difficult to see what happens. China, on the other hand, is going for green industrialization, but for its own merits. It sees the economic value for that in itself, and that's why it's pushed so many green industries, and it's used it as a tool of industrial development, I think, really quite effectively. And I think Africa has to do likewise, rather than see it in terms of international obligations or a transactional thing where we'll do this on and you will provide us the financing. I think we have to do it on the grounds that it stands up on its own merits, you understand? And I think clearly for energy, for example, on the continent, those green resources need to be developed as far as they can, and in terms of industrializing as well. And I guess that's where the AFCFTA comes into the conclusion, to the equation here. I mean, the AFCFTA can offer very substantial benefits for our member states in terms of increasing the trade and investment with their African counterparts. And under the AFCFTA, the rules can be fixed to be mutually beneficial, and they will be binding. Yasmin was talking about meeting the standards that the European Union is imposing on things like the carbon or the deforestation. I would actually say that firstly, we need to realize the European Union is a declining trading partner for Africa. So in this part of Africa, in Eastern Africa, it's less than 10% of exports currently go to the European Union. On average, for our countries, around 30% goes already to the continental market. The African market is already much more important than the European market. And I've always been struck by the degree of hypocrisy, really, of the European Union putting on carbon taxes on exports from the African continent, while at the same time they're importing about $80 billion of fuels, gas and oil, from the African continent on a yearly basis. It makes absolutely no sense, because we're talking about a very marginal part of Africa's exports to Europe that's considered to be, carbon or deforesting. It would be our coffee, tea exports, for example. It would be some of the manufacturing from North Africa perhaps impacted. And I just feel that these rules are self-defeating for the European Union as well, but very hypocritical. If the European Union was very serious about the carbon issue, it would stop importing Africa's oil and gas. And clearly it's increased that over the recent years because it's lost access to Russian oil. So I think there's a lot of inconsistencies in the discussions, and I think we have to be quite pragmatic and hard-nosed in our appreciation of what's really going to be happening.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Moll. Now, I want to bring in Yasmin. Of course, Dr. Andrew Moll did mention about the second largest emitter, the United States, who currently, I have a whole list of things that the United States has been up to, and none of them is really any good. Undermining the WTO, now pulling out of the COP negotiations. This year, the United States will actually not be sending any delegation to COP30. So there is a lot there. And I want to ask Yasmin how these international geopolitical issues, how then do they further make our position as Africa and as, developing countries even much more difficult to be able to negotiate as partners at the climate conference?
especially partners like us who still need trade to develop our countries.
Thank you, Daniel. A quick reflection is that, and that relates a bit to what Martin and Andrew said. I think we cannot we cannot put everything on the climate and trade agenda at risk because of one member. I don't think that's the smart thing to do. And I think that yes, US is a major trade partner, but the channel is still open, and discussions are happening, and we need to admit that discussions are happening outside also of the WTO or the UNFCCC premises on bilateral level. So I think the multilateral system is at strain, and this we all recognize. But at the same time, there are opportunities to negotiate Africa's place in the new green economy, whether regionally within Africa, to develop a strong consolidated position, or with trade partners bilaterally and regionally. And we've seen how trade has been pulled out a bit from the multilateral space to the regional space. So this is something that is happening, but I wouldn't say that that due to this, the opportunities to continue discussion on trade and climate are diminishing completely. But let me also come back to a few points that Andrew said and Martin said about AFCFTA and about Africa's approach within that geopolitized context. And I would like to reiterate that Africa's response must be proactive and strategic. When I previously mentioned that perhaps these measures measures with climate objectives are spreading beyond the EU, and we need to be more of a forward-looking of how the economy is transforming, and hence consider how to alleviate the compliance costs, and have a partnership in this discussion in order to enhance the design and implementation of such measures so that they can be drivers of development priorities for Africa. But I want to add that it's at TESS, we've been advocating at the international level for a proactive and strategic positioning of Africa in the trade and climate nexus discussion. We've been seeing how the discussion on the nexus of trade and climate, or the narrative, has been driven for some time by the developed countries' narrative. And in order to encourage a more proactive rather than a reactive positioning of Africa, and being locked in that reactive position to measures that are being adopted by trade partners, we've been advocating for a response that is proactive and strategic, grounded in longer-term visions of how trade policy and cooperation can support climate and development objectives. In other words, you need trade-related climate strategies to support a net zero, but at the same time, climate resilient development pathway that is adapted to the continent needs, but also at the national level for each country and their development climate objectives. So At TESS, we are working with a range of experts internationally to develop a methodology that can support developing countries and stakeholders in the development of trade-related climate strategies for climate resilient development. The approach aims to support the identification of trade policies and trade diplomacy avenues that are grounded in national climate priorities related to both mitigation and adaptation, and frameworks for development and climate resilience. Importantly, the methodology aims to support countries to consider implications for trade of the evolving landscape of domestic and international climate actions, and how the evolving climate itself impacts the trading prospects of the country. This strategic approach aims to transform trade policy from being something advanced in isolation from wider climate and development goals to an area of policy making that is central to consider as part of climate smart development planning. And it includes also thinking of avenues and possibilities of cooperation at the various levels, whether regional, with bilateral partners, and also key interests to advance in the multilateral level. We've been currently working on this methodology, and we've been taking it into a pilot. We have a pilot project to implement with the Philippines. We started stakeholder conversations over the development of a trade-related climate strategy for climate resilient development in the Philippines through stakeholder conversations that involve the various trade, climate-related government bodies and entities, but also private sector, civil society, and other stakeholders in order to shape that longer-term vision about how to utilize trade for the different national interests of the country in the longer term, in the medium and longer range of time, and how to reconcile these interests and develop its own narrative on the trade and climate nexus in order to advance it in the various fora.
All right, thank you very much, Yasmin. I want to bring in Vahini from the South Center. Now, from where I see it, and you know, I'm a journalist, so I'm journalists. We really get frustrated very easily, and that's how we end up writing, you know, very complicated headlines because we just get frustrated. You know, that's why we would write headlines like "Africa doomed." Simple. That's a journalist that is frustrated. And I want to ask, how are we going to trade? Because we are trying to use trade to, first of all, develop our economies as African countries, but how are we going to trade with the EU slapping unfair regulations on us and the United States slapping tariffs on us? It's like we cannot win in you know, in terms of trade. You also have a question from the chat group. We have Liz May, who asks, are the Africa Group proposals at the WTO on reform and on policy space gaining interest in and momentum amongst other developing country WTO members, or is it naive to think there will be progress in this area? I would also like to ask any of you who have questions to please put them in the chat box so that we can put them to our panel. All right, Vahini, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Just to respond to this question that I only saw now, sorry, in the box. There is a lot of traction. I think over the last few years, the Africa Group have had a very defined agenda on addressing this coherence between the AfCFTA and the WTO, particularly on supporting or having rules that can support better regional integration, but I think more importantly, domestic and regional industrial development. And so this has primarily been through the pursuit of proposals on policy space as they relate to certain agreements like the TRIPS, the TRIMS, and also the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So the challenge has been over the last couple of years, what we've seen is that in as much as there is interest in kind of having discussions on industrial policy, there has also been an impetus by the African group to also address industrial development from the perspective of the green transition. Unfortunately, yes, there is interest, but what we've seen is that this agenda has really been captured in a way, but also heavily distorted by, for instance, the European Union, who is trying to use the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, for instance, under WTO reform, to reopen the agreement so that the subsidies that they are giving towards their so-called green transition can be justified. And it's also to mitigate certain of the areas relating to their new green industrial policy, but also with respect to measures like the CBAM and their deforestation regulations. So there is a lot of interest, and interestingly, the WTO reform agenda is kind of some kind of shape. And one of the issues that has been flagged as a priority, and that is likely going to get a lot of airtime and probably be presented to trade ministers in March next year, is on the issue of leveling the playing field, but also in terms of addressing this notion of fair competition. And so this is where we're seeing an increased and actually a very growing increase in having the WTO deal particularly with the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. It's not very clear right now in terms of Africa's priorities if they are very content with the direction in which this conversation is going. Because I understand that a lot of developing countries have also brought in the notion that they don't really have the fiscal space to provide massive subsidies. And it's one of the reasons why the South Center has also been advocating for primarily trying to, in the short to medium term, address rather the TRIMS agreement. So potentially looking at areas in which certain TRIMS measures could either be subject to a peace clause, meaning that to allow developing countries and least developed countries to introduce local content requirements, etc., and that they won't be challenged if done in a transparent way and towards the green transition. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Vahini. I want to bring in Martin, who has two questions, I think. Mugambwa Owen. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mugambwa Owen. My question is to Mr. Mumu. And he mentioned that climate policies should not leave LDCs behind as they are least responsible for the climate crisis. With countries like Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda on a path to graduate from LDC status and will lose vital support that would have been vital in curbing the growing climate vulnerabilities and increased pressure to decarbonize. So what would he suggest to assist in this expected financing drop, in addition to the growing cutback on development finance? My other question is on the carbon markets as a tool to address the gaps in climate finance, with the Article 6 on the carbon markets being operationalized in Baku during COP29, and countries like Uganda coming up with regulations on carbon markets. My question is on whether the carbon markets are reasonable, sustainable, and viable source of climate finance, especially with the way they are currently structured. Well, you did talk about money, so I expected you to get many questions about money, and here you go. Can we use the carbon markets to get this money that you are calling for? Martin, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I'll start with the graduation from the LDC group. When you look at our development objectives in African countries, or even what the AFCFTA looks at, the Agenda 2063, as well as national policies and the like, they all talk about graduation from LDC in its specific terms, because you are looking at increasing incomes, you're looking at increasing employment, industrialization, and all these decent jobs. All these points at graduating countries from LDCs. And so this is something that is positive if we achieve. But of course, we cannot not look at this in purely economic terms, because this is the challenge we face when we just look at it from economic terms, and we look at the GDP, and then we look at the population, and then we say, yeah, we've graduated from LDCs. And this is why there are these discussions and proposals for the transition period for this graduation, some kind of a safe landing. But again, this needs that a lot of that multilateral consensus or approaches at the bilateral level, which we have seen as now becoming more and more challenging. And so for me, I would be happy if many or all African countries genuinely graduate from LDCs in an inclusive way, in a way that the economy is able to employ more people, to have better wages, to have decent housing, to address the challenges faced by the urban poor, to address the rural poverty, modernize and transform agriculture, as well as having ecological practices that are not destructive. So all these objectives is what I would look at. Then if they are met and then we graduate from LDCs, then that is perfect. But if they are not met and these points and the pointers are really towards that they're not being met, but we are likely graduating. And the major reason I would say for this is this private sector led approaches to development. On one side, we've seen increase in private investment. We've seen companies popping up. We've seen factories popping up. But we need to look at the inclusiveness of that, and there are a lot of shortfalls on that. So first, in terms of graduation, this is what I could say. This is the prize. I could say in quotes that African countries that are LDCs would face if we generally transition from the LDC group. So, and a lot of these are national responsibilities also to ensure that we have national policies that can promote inclusion, that can address productive capacity. But then at the global level, then we need that environment that is facilitative. So attracting funding will reduce from that aspect, but also private funding will, it will be more expensive to borrow, for instance. But the economic environment is also expected then to improve if we transition. And so it also comes with those incentives that can facilitate development. In terms of carbon market, again, this is a challenge with over-reliance on market-led approaches to policy making. We, at the multilateral level, we have seen this direction, or that everything can only be addressed through the private sector or market-led approaches. And this is why the issue of carbon market becomes problematic as one of the strategies for addressing climate change. One, we have seen a lot of greenwashing by companies. And this, we really see that the action that they are taking is not reflective of their footprints, and it is making them use it as a campaign or kind of public relations tool to look good out there, to have a good image out there that they are doing something, when in the actual sense they their emissions are increasing, their footprints are increasing, and their profitability are also increasing. And more worryingly, there are also challenges in terms of local livelihoods, because a lot of these projects in instances involve a lot of displacement of local communities, involve a lot of privatization of what I would say public or community resources, and capitalizing on that for the few. And so we see these companies benefiting from it in that sense. And then it is used as a tool during negotiations of the action that developed countries are taking to address climate change. And when in the actual sense we have seen reduced funding, we have seen less commitment on the funds, and also as Andrew mentioned, we see less and less funding coming up. So African countries then would have a choice to make. I am one of the people who are of the opinion that when we go to, for negotiations to address trade policy, if I didn't have trade agreements or climate change or whatever, we should go with strategies. And for instance, we should not appear, I mean, African countries should not appear as being too willing, I mean, to take broad commitments to address climate change when it's not being replicated by the other. If we do that, then we come back with agreements that are not facilitative of our development objectives. First, we present what we are doing at the national level, the NDCs, for instance. We present what is being done at local levels by the local governments or decentralized units or federal governments in African countries that have that. But then we look at the bigger picture of one, not radically undermining our development by rubbishing all the opportunities to harness the resources we have, but we should look at the issue of responsibly using these resources and trying to innovate in such a way that we can increase, we can introduce sustainability practices in them and transition in a way that is just, that is not that doesn't leave others behind, but also transition that can be, should be commensurate with what other countries are doing. If, for instance, we see countries like Germany, or a lot of the EU countries, and even the US, going back in fossil fuels, I mean, and importing more and more of oil and gas, and using this really for their industrialization upon the recognition of the geopolitical issues. And we see also countries like China, on one hand, investing a lot in green technology, but on the other, also like polluting a lot. So we then need to ask ourselves a question, that if African countries that don't contribute as much to this problem, how far would our action address the global problem? Because we only have one planet. So this only strengthens the need, even though we have a low, we have limited multilateralism at this point, but it is the only chance that it's the only option that we need to continue fighting for it, such that at the multilateral level, we have an environment that can allow us to address climate change, that can facilitate development in an inclusive and green, and have green industrial policies. But at the national level, we should also focus on the practical issues that we need to facilitate our development, promoting industrialization, facilitating innovations in agriculture, and taking advantage of the opportunities that come from industrial technologies, trying to facilitate technological transfer, and collaborating with countries that are much more advanced in this technology to try and replicate it in Africa and transfer this technology. Of course, there are a lot of intellectual property issues, rights issues also that comes into play, but we need to play our cards well as African countries and try to weather the storm and survive within the storm, because it will not get better. I mean, it would only get worse if we don't act. And so it means that a lot of actions should need to be taken at both the national level, while maintaining that bigger picture of promoting or securing still a consensus, which in an increasingly difficult environment to achieve at the multilateral level.
All right, thank you very much. Now, Dr. Andrew Mould, you have multiple questions, but you have one from Liz May. Liz May says, in the absence of changes in WTO rules, it will be important for African governments to take the initiative and proactively put in place green industrial policies, regardless of whether they are WTO compliant. Do you see appetite for this? And are there some examples you could give? Another one is still from Liz May. No, I think it's the same question. Yes, I think it's the same question. Mugamba says all speakers have made mention of either the Africa Continental Free Trade Area or the need for growth in South-to-South cooperation in trade. My question is, beyond trading between our African or Southern partners, how else could we leverage these partnerships and relationships to help in the transition to lower carbon economies? And John Turiakira says at COP29, we negotiated for the new collective quantified goal for climate financing. Only $300 billion was pledged. Is there an opportunity to reactivate the negotiation of $1.3 trillion at COP30? Because let's face it, the Global South remains with high climate adaptation needs. John Robert Turiakira is the Executive Director of Africa Green Health Network. And I do know that Dr. Mold already told us that the money is not coming. So here are some questions to you, Dr. Andrew. Go ahead.
Yes, effectively, that 1.3 trillion, I think, is very wish thinking, isn't it, in the current environment where development cooperation and assistance is declining. Yeah, so those are quite big questions. On Liz May's question, yes, Africa, I mean, clearly has quite a lot of green industrialization initiatives. There is the African Green Industrialization Initiative itself, which was launched under the Nairobi Declaration and reinforced at the COP28. And that will promise to mobilize $100 billion for renewable powered industrial clusters and green value chains, for example. We have countries like Kenya investing quite heavily, promoting green hydrogen and renewable energy corridors, South Africa, Morocco, Nigeria. So many countries are investing in these sectors. My hope is the AFCFTA will give a significant boost to some of these industries so that the continent become a degree more self-reliant. There's only one analysis that's actually been done that I know of on the link between the AFCFTA and its environmental impact recently, and that was a paper by Marta Bengoa and colleagues in the Journal of African Trade. It was a special issue which I was one of the editors, published 3 or 4 years ago now, 2021, I think it was. And that paper basically found that even under full implementation of the AFCFTA and the increases of trade you would see, emissions of CO2 would barely go up. 0.3% was their result, just a tiny increment in CO2 emissions. And actually in some pollutants, you would see a decline. I presume because of efficiency at a continental level, so that via trade, the emissions intensity and the pollutant intensity of industries would improve. So that was quite an interesting study, which I would recommend anybody interested in this theme to look at. I share some of Martin's views on the importance of member states actually taking action, or at the regional level. I'm more optimistic about that than at the multilateral level at the current juncture. And so, as I said before, I think China has promoted green industrialization for its own selfish motives in many ways, and it's been a very effective part of its industrial policy. And I think African countries would be wise to emulate that. Did I answer most of that, Daniel? Oh, there was South-South cooperation, wasn't there, basically? There was a question about... Yes, I mean, I'm always trying to stress to people, I think a lot of people have the mindset that still most of the trade is with Europe or with the United States. The United States has been a very radically declining trading partner over the last 10, 15 years. And the European Union has also declined in importance. I do believe in the power of some of that South-South trade. It's interesting that China now has offered that tariff-free access for African countries, although people are still concerned about the non-tariff barriers. Beyond the trade elements, I think there is a lot of scope for South-South investment in green industries. And clearly some of the developing countries now have really quite an important lead, particularly China, but also some of the newly industrialized countries, relatively newly, like South Korea, for example. So more South-South investment in the sustainable energy sector, for example, would surely be welcome. And the beauty of the AFCFTA is it creates a larger market to make those kind of investments more sustainable. So I would see a lot more investment, for example, in batteries, Lithuanian battery technologies, battery-powered vehicles and motorbikes and the like. And you see that already, but in policies that countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda have applied. So Ethiopia banning the import of gas-fueled vehicles. The second-hand vehicle market, of course, is a big problem as well. So I think through collective action, through greater South-South cooperation, but particularly national action, there is more policy space, I think, now for countries to take the initiative in these areas rather than wait on forlorn hopes perhaps of multilateral support and multilateral agreement at the moment. I genuinely don't see that to be forthcoming.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Mold, for answering those. There is one last question to you from Herbert Cafero. His question is, in the context of the AFCFTA implementation, particularly its sectoral committees and strategies, what mechanisms or policy instruments are being considered or could be developed to integrate climate action and sustainability objectives into trade facilitation, industrial policy, and regional value chain development? That's his question.
Right. This is why I issued a caution before I spoke. My views may not necessarily reflect the official views of my organization I represent. Simply because I'm a little bit skeptical about the link in the AFCFTA directly with the green agenda. It doesn't mean I do not think that the green agenda is incredibly important, as I just explained. It is very important for industrial development, and it's clearly the way the global economy is going. But I do not favor the linking of the AFCFTA objectives with the green agenda, on the same grounds that I do not with many other additional areas that people would like to see included in the AFCFTA. And the reason is, and this was something that Francis Mangini and myself spelt out in our book, Borderless Africa, we're just concerned of the overburdening of the AFCFTA agenda with too many peripheral issues which are not central to the core one of the AFCFTA. And the core one of the AFCFTA is to increase the intensity of intra-African trade and investment and to have more integrated economies. And a lot of the external partners wish to include other agendas there, the green economy being one of them, inequality, labor rights, youth employment. It's quite a long list of things that people want to include. I don't think that's wise because I really do believe at the current juncture, the continent needs to focus on, firstly, establishing a strong continental free trade area, and secondly, moving then quickly towards a customs union. Those should be the priorities for the continent. That does not mean any of these other issues are not important, but I think it doesn't absolve member states from the responsibility of dealing with those issues individually, but not tie it up with the AFCFTA. Because if we make the AFCFTA a catch-all for all of the continent's developmental aspirations, I fear it may fail. But as long as we keep the focus on the importance of greater economic integration, then there's a good chance of success.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Mold. Now I'm gonna we're gonna go for our closing remarks. Synthesis, if you have synthesized something that you have picked from here or something that you want us to remember. The question that I always ask is, if we were to forget everything that you said here today, what shouldn't we forget? I'm going to start with Vahini.
Hi, that's an interesting one. I think given the current context that we're in, I really think that we need to be a lot more realistic about where things are going, and whether multilateral platforms are really going to deliver. What is the moral imperative and the expectation? And I think we need to look a bit more inward in terms of really focusing on national and domestic priorities and development, to try take those first and initial steps towards our own development, and also seeing the direction in which the multilateral trading system, for instance, is heading. I do believe that there are now a lot more opportunities for South-South cooperation and looking more inwardly towards regional integration kind of arrangements, and also cooperation, as well as increasing efforts with Global South countries starting to lead on a lot of technologies that are relevant to the green transition. And so I think maybe some of our core focus should also be on that, in light of what is expected to be quite a difficult next 4 to 5 years in this global multilateral cooperation framework that we're operating in. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Vahini. Yasmin, please go ahead and tell us your parting shots.
Thank you, Daniel. If you don't mind, I would like to remind or bring something very quickly to my closing remark, and then answer to your question. One thing is adaptation, which I think whenever we're speaking about trade and climate, most of our conversation is going towards mitigation, decarbonization. And adaptation is key. And despite the fact that, yes, well, the money is, yes, the goal that has been agreed was not as ambitious as countries hoped for. This COP is one key element of this COP is to negotiate increasing the dedicated finance for adaptation, and I think this is a key goal for African countries. So while we cannot increase the number, we can try and dedicate more financing to the priorities of Africa. So let's hope that UNFCCC negotiations will be able to deliver on that. My second point on this is that because every time we initiate a discussion on trade and climate, we end up discussing more mitigation, decarbonization, green industrialization, and less adaptation. The link between trade and adaptation needs more work from the way I see it needs more work from the trade and climate community. We need to unlock the links between trade policies and advancing on adaptation goals. We need to make adaptation investable, and we need to understand how trade policies, not only reacting to climate measures related to decarbonization, but how can trade policies foster adaptation, foster resilience in key trade-related sectors such as agriculture. More needs to be done on this area. And finally, just to say, reiterate that there are opportunities to seek the interests of Africa in this trade and climate nexus discussion. It's clear that Africa holds many of the resources needed for the net zero pathway and transition, and a proactive, strategic, medium, long-term approach is needed to be advanced, both at the national, like Vahini said, do a little bit of the homework at the national level to align and marry together the various national interests, from development to industrialization to energy transition to climate objectives, whether adaptation or mitigation, with trade objectives and aspirations in the future. This will be key, and once this is done, a more clarity on positions in multilateral level, on interests to seek at the regional level, and on interests to seek bilaterally will prevail. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yasmin. Martin, go ahead. What shouldn't we forget from everything that you have said here today?
Well, it's been an interesting deliberation. I think for me, I would look at the issue of facilitating regional integration, using the AFCFTA as a tool to promote the development interests of African countries that we mentioned earlier, that we discussed earlier. And I take a lot of Andrew's opinion on the need to take action at the national level and promote economic integration of Africa and not overburden the AFCFTA with too many things. I tend to believe that, for instance, the women and youth protocol, for instance, of the AFCFTA, can be a lot of action can be done at the national level, for instance, to promote even the issues we need that we have put in the annex of the protocol of the AFCFTA itself to facilitate some of these things. But we shouldn't forget the need to really promote more intra-African trade in terms of exports and imports, because these are the products basically that can be much more inclusive, that can be built, that we can build the value chain more, that we can easily harmonize the standards. But we need, again, also investment at that level to facilitate, for instance, the infrastructure and the like, and the political will beyond pronouncements. But for me, still, the second issue that I still see is that at the multilateral level, I mean, things are not good, but the alternative of that is now being pushed a lot in terms of engaging bilaterally, I think it only, this is the reality we face, but it only strengthens the need to promote that integration in Africa. If we can reach the customs union in Africa, then African countries can be able really to engage from a stronger position with other bilateral trading partners. So those are the two issues that I get.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. Now, Dr. Andrew Moulds, your parting shots.
Yeah, well, to save time, I'd like to subscribe to what Martin's conclusions were, Yasmin as well, and Vahini as well. I liked her initial summary. One thing Martin said earlier about the oil in Uganda and the fact that, you know, the international financial community is not supporting those kind of initiatives. Somalia has also recently found oil. I always shudder a little bit when countries find oil, to be quite honest with you. Generally, if you look at the economic record of countries that find oil, they tend to underperform. And if you look at the IMF reports on the regional economy, you will see that the oil exporters are the worst performing countries in terms of growth. So I think there's a lot of rationale behind the green economy on its own grounds. You don't need to link it to any other policy measures. You know, leave the oil in the ground, double down on some of these renewable energies. We have plentiful supplies of that. We have great examples like the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia and Kenya. Very high percentage of its energies is based on renewables. So I'm quite optimistic from that point of view. And yeah, let's leave the carbon fuels where they belong, in the ground.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Mould. And that's all we had time for our panel this afternoon in East Africa. Depending on where else you are in the world, it could be a different time of the day. I would like now to invite Miss Jane Nalunga to give us her closing remarks. She started us off with amazing quotes. I wonder what she has for us to close. Go ahead, Miss Jane, in Kampala.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for the good work done, for bringing out all those issues. First of all, I would like to thank Vahini. Vahini, thank you so much, our keynote speaker. Your presentation was really, really great. And I think we are discussing here with Herbert that we ask that we publish it. I also like to thank the panelists. It was a good, great debate, great ideas. And I have liked the candidness, you know, no sugarcoating on issues. For me, I have liked that. There is no money, you know. And, you know, for me, such statements, which are really true, but which we sometimes gloss over, makes us rethink what we can realistically be able to do as Africa and as individual countries. Maybe for me, the greatest takeaway has been the fact that we need to start at the national level. And maybe all of you addressed the issue of more space at national level. Then we escalate at regional level, and then we go on at the global level. But also really being candid and being, I don't know how to put, strong-nosed with our positions, you know. So I have really liked that debate, and I know that we are going to use most of these issues, especially for us as Siatini, in our programming and in our further discussion. I also like to thank all the participants who have been there, who have been able to bring in a number of issues, asked questions, very important questions, which have made the discussion really, really interesting. So thank you so much. Thank you, Vahini. Thank you, Martin. Yasmin, thank you so much. Dr. Andrew Mould, thank you so much. We are really grateful, not for just this time, but for the continued cooperation and support, and also technical backup to Siatini. So thank you so much, all the participants, and I wish you a beautiful evening. Thank you.
Goodbye, Jane.
Did I say thank you to Daniel? Yes, I did.
Yes, you did.
Amazing.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for this conversation. Let's keep the conversation going online. Go to Twitter at Siatini Uganda and converse with us, talk to us, and also talk to your leaders about some of the issues that you have had here and ask them to fix them. That's their job. My name is Daniel Otaya, and it's a good evening from us here in Uganda. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.